How hard is it to change the nut and saddle on your acoustic guitar? Well, that depends. Do you want it done right, or do you just want it done? And when you do, what material do you use? Does it even matter? We're going to find out. Let's get into it. Hello everyone, this is Adam from Miller's Custom Guitars. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you are new here, this channel is all about understanding how to get the most out of your guitar, helping to equip you as a guitar owner to be better prepared to service your instruments yourself, and pushing ourselves together to constantly grow, learn, and improve our servicing and maintaining skills. Today, I'm going to be starting a 3-part mini-series where I take a deep dive into the nut and saddle materials on the acoustic guitar. And I'm going to show how to correctly install this material onto your guitar. This series is basically going to be a follow-up to my first real YouTube video ever, where I compared the sounds between an acoustic guitar with a plastic nut and saddle and the same acoustic guitar with a bone nut and a Tusq saddle. That video has remained my most popular video ever, garnering almost 20,000 views to date. Obviously, people are interested in this discussion, so I thought I would take a closer look at the topic. In this mini-series, we're going to take a look at 3 different materials that nuts and saddles are frequently made from: plastic, bone, and Tusq. Obviously, this is not an exhaustive list of materials, but these are, I feel, the most commonly used. We're also going to take an in-depth look at how to install each type of nut and each type of saddle. I'll also talk about the similarities as well as the differences in how each type of material needs to be processed in order to achieve proper installation, because they have differences. I will highlight the differences in material costs and labor time to help you to make the best decision for you and your customers if you're doing this for work. In this first video, we're going to be focusing on replacing the saddle, as well as have an in-depth discussion about the differences in costs between all 3 different materials. In the second video, we're going to be focusing on the nut and thoroughly discuss how to do a proper nut installation no matter what type of material you're using. I will also show you how to cut a bone nut from scratch in case that's something you're interested in trying. And I'll also show you what to do if the nut is too low or too high. In the third video, we'll go through the steps of finalizing your setup now that your nut and saddle are properly installed, before moving on to a direct side-by-side comparison with sound samples, so you can find out if you can actually hear a difference between the materials and see if they actually make a difference to the sound of the guitar, and you can decide for yourself. Understanding the tonal differences that each type of material will make to your instruments is very helpful, but none of that means anything if you don't know how to install those parts properly. And over the course of this series, we're going to clean that up. Let's get started. Making and fitting acoustic nuts and saddles is an essential skill for any guitar tech. But even if you aren't a guitar tech, this is something you can learn how to do correctly. Yes, you. So that you'll be able to dial in your own guitars. Having said that, this job can sometimes be difficult to learn to do because many of the tasks that you will see me doing in these videos involve specialty tools sometimes. However, I'll do my best to point out affordable tool alternatives whenever possible. I think it best to talk about each spot on the guitar all the way through, discussing each material type. So in this video, we're going to start at the bridge and we'll talk first about plastic. So I understand why a manufacturer might choose to put plastic materials on a acoustic guitar when they're building one. However, for a long time, I was baffled as to why anyone would choose to put a plastic nut or saddle on a guitar that they were working on for themselves willingly.
Willingly?
Yes.
Especially if they were already going through all of the trouble of replacing these parts anyway. Well, the answer is because plastic parts install quickly, they're easy to work on, and they're cheap. For example, I've found this listing on Amazon for 5 plastic saddles and 5 plastic nuts for $10. Look, that's enough materials to do 5 sets of guitars for $2 each. That's pretty cheap. When working with saddles, you have 3 measurements that you've got to be concerned with: thickness, length, and height. Now look, this is going to be true with all 3 materials as well. Now look, I like to verify the thickness first, and if possible, you want a really snug fit. This is going to help to transfer all of the vibrations from the strings to the top of your guitar. I use a piece of flat board, like some plywood, or I use a flooring tile that I got from the local restore, and some sticky backed sandpaper. But you could use a sheet of sandpaper and some spray adhesive, that works great. Or you could even just scrape off the material with a sharp razor blade, as long as you do it evenly. Move the saddle back and forth, applying even pressure, checking the thickness constantly until it fits perfectly. I like to check the thickness with calipers, but if you don't have calipers, just work it evenly and check it regularly. If you accidentally sand it too thin, well, guess what? You just bought a 5-pack. Try again. In my case, I got lucky with the plastic saddle and the thickness was perfect right out of the package. Well, that's exactly what we're hoping for if we're using plastic, because if we're trying to save money, it helps if we can save time too, right? Once the thickness of the saddle is dialed in, then I work on the length. For a prefabricated saddle like these plastic ones, you might get lucky and it might just drop in like it did with the thickness. More than likely, you'll have to do some finessing, and I did with this one. I find the best way is to measure the saddle slot with calipers, then lock in the measurement and use the calipers as a guide as I dial in the saddle length. On a soft material like plastic, it's probably best to bypass power tools and even saws and just trim it down to final length using the same adhesive-backed sandpaper or even just an emery board. Once the length is good, make sure to round over the corners using the sandpaper, and it should drop right into the saddle slot with a perfect fit. The last step is saddle height. Since this process is going to be the same for all 3 types of material, I'm going to hold off for a few minutes before I explain how to dial that in, and we'll do that at the end. Also, before I move on, I wanted to mention that I was honestly shocked at how quickly the plastic saddle was ready to go. I had the saddle fitted perfectly in less than 5 minutes, not counting the height. I now understand why this might be a solution for some situations, especially where budget is a concern. But let's move on and talk about how to make an acoustic saddle out of bone, and why would you even want to? Humankind has been using the bones of dead creatures to help make musical instruments for literally thousands of years. The bone flute showed in this image is thought to be about 50,000 years old. And there are countless examples of people throughout the ages using animal bones when they make instruments. Despite all of our modern technological advancements, there's still a bunch of reasons that luthiers all around the world prefer bone to all other materials. One of the primary reasons is that bone is extremely plentiful. Almost every creature on Earth has bones, and every creature on Earth eventually dies. The bones that we are using are the byproduct of the meat packing industry. I kind of think of it like using the whole buffalo. In fact, you can even use buffalo bone. Any sufficiently large animal will yield suitable bones for nuts and saddles. I've heard of people using giraffe bones. However, most of the time we're talking about cow bones, and we're usually referring to the femur bone because of its long, relatively straight section, and the bone walls tend to be thick and relatively uniform. The second reason that luthiers like bone is that it's cheap. Since bone is so plentiful, it's also really affordable. You can get a 10-pack of pre-cut nut blanks and a 10-pack of pre-cut saddle blanks from Philadelphia Luthier for just under 30 bucks for everything before shipping and tax. That's enough materials to do 10 guitars, and it breaks down to about $3 per guitar. That's pretty affordable. But here's the kicker. If you're really trying to save money, you can get even cheaper than that. If you've got a bandsaw, a belt sander, and some spare time on your hands, you have just about everything you need to make your own blanks for pennies on the dollar. If the town that you live in has a pet food store, and I'm betting that it does, then it's very likely that they sell cow femur bones to use as dog chew treats. Choose a nice long straight one with thick walls. You can use your bandsaw to cut that femur bone up into blanks for other work pieces. Yeah, sure, it's more work, but if you're really trying to get the maximum bang for your buck, that is a way that you can really make it happen. This one cow femur bone is available for sale at my local PetSmart for $9.50. And I was able to use one almost identical to this to get a whole handful of usable blanks that I could use for a number of work pieces. If you're gonna do something like this, just make sure you avoid the ones that are stuffed with peanut butter or chicken flavored or smoked. Your dog might like that, but your guitar and any potential future customers are not gonna like that. I did that a while ago, and I bought one femur bone from my local PetSmart. I was able to take that one bone and use it to make I don't know, 8 or 9 or 10 bone blanks. Check this out. This is just some of the bone blanks I got. I could use each one of these to make a number of different, I could probably get 2 saddles out of that. I could probably get 2 or 3 saddles out of that. I can get maybe 1 saddle out of that, 2 or 3 or 4 nuts out of that. When you break that all down, that's anywhere from 50 to 75 cents a piece, depending on how many you're able to get from it. Look, the third reason that bone is so popular is that bone is the perfect combination of being soft enough to process and work with hand tools, and yet hard enough to stand the test of time. It also has the benefit of looking beautiful when polished up. Additionally, because bone is so dense, it's a great material for transmitting the vibration of the guitar strings into the guitar. In other words, it sounds great with a bright glassy tone and an even response across the tonal spectrum, and it's beautiful. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't have its downsides. Some of the major downsides of using bone is that it's the most labor intensive. It requires the most expertise and craftsmanship, and it sometimes requires specialty tools to work with. It also creates bone dust while you're working with it, which shouldn't be inhaled as it's bad for your health, and it smells horrible. However, many luthiers consider it the standard for nut and saddle material, including myself, so we definitely need to talk about how to use it. So I'm going to be using a saddle blank from Philadelphia Luthier, and just like before, we need to determine the length and the thickness of the saddle, and we want a nice tight fit. These blanks are excessively long, which I'm grateful for, and the first thing we got to do is get them to a ballpark length so I'm not wasting any elbow grease. I take a measurement from the saddle slot and I transfer that to the blank and add a little bit extra, and then I just saw it off with a hobby saw. You can easily do this with a disc sander, but I just did it with the saw because it was right there. I then move into dialing the thickness, and I use calipers to check my work until I have a nice snug fit exactly like before. This time, I also need to add a radius to the top of the saddle to match the fingerboard. I use a radius gauge to determine the radius of the fingerboard and then transfer that to the saddle using the same radius gauge. I take this over to my disc sander to get right up to the line before finalizing the radius with a file and checking that radius with the radius gauge. Now, you don't need to have a disc sander to do this. You could do the whole thing by hand with a file, or even with a radius block that has been lined with sandpaper. But that's what I used. Once the radius has been added to the top of the saddle, then we need to determine the saddle's length. I measure the required saddle length with digital calipers, and then I like to push the 0 button on my calipers. This way, as I work on the length and take measurements, it will tell me how much more I need to remove. Additionally, it's important to keep the bottom of the saddle perpendicular to the sides as you're sanding. It's easy to sand in an angle, which can throw off your reading. Once the saddle is the right length, I round over the corners until it will drop in. And I like to use an emery board to do that. You should have a very snug fit, like almost enough that you can lift the guitar, but it should slide all the way in. The next thing to do is to determine the saddle's compensation. I string the guitar up and I use a small length of old plain 10 gauge guitar string, which I bent into like an L shape, and I kind of rounded it over the end so I had something to hold on to. And I use that to determine the string takeoff point and where that should be on the saddle. This is basically like setting the intonation on an electric guitar, except I'm using the string as a temporarily movable saddle to determine the proper takeoff location, rather than an adjustable saddle position with a screwdriver like on an electric guitar. I start with my intonation tool in the middle of the permanent saddle and then check the intonation. I then loosen the string and move the setup tool to the appropriate direction and try to correct the intonation. I then retune and recheck. Once I found the correct spot for intonation, I mark the takeoff position for each string using a mechanical pencil. Once that's done, I move the saddle to my saddle vise because I'm planning on shaping the top surface. For the E through G strings, I determine a line that's the best average between all 4 of those marks, and I mark that. It's usually a pretty straight line between those 4. Then our mark will swoop back to meet the B string before elegantly swooping back to meet the high E string. I'm kind of attempting to copy the curves found on my Taylor saddle. You've seen compensation like this before, but anyway, that's what I'm trying to do. Once I've marked where my compensation line is going to be, I can start filing away the unwanted material. When making a saddle, we don't want the top to be rounded. Instead, we want it to come to an almost triangular point, but not one that's too sharp. But this will help the notes to have a nice clear tone with a defined takeoff point. I use my file and long even strokes to file away the material until only my compensation mark is left on top. Around the B string, I have to switch to a smaller file as this is more precise work. Once I'm happy with the shape of the compensation, I can sand and polish away the filing marks with progressively finer sandpaper and polish it up until it gleams. The saddle should now fit perfectly in both length and thickness, and it should have a radius and compensation. The last thing to tackle is the saddle height, and as mentioned before, we'll save that for the end because the process is the same for all 3 materials. I will note that in my situation, I lowered the saddle height before doing the compensation, and just wanted to point that out. Last up is Tusq. Tusq is made by Graphtec and is a manufactured material. It's hard to talk about the features of a Tusq saddle without sounding like an advertisement, but I don't have a dog in this fight here. This is not a sponsored video. So look, let's just talk about it. Tusq claims to be superior to bone in that it provides more harmonic content in the upper mid range of the guitar. I even showed the audible difference in a material drop test in my first video, and you can notice the difference again in this clip, and it's plain to hear. Check it out. Tusq also claims that the material is more consistent than natural materials, which can have different densities due to the grain of the material. They claim that this helps to transfer the correct frequencies more efficiently and more consistently from piece to piece. The big upside for Tusq compared to other materials is that it's a great middle ground between ease and speed of installation without compromising your desire for great tone. The downside is that it's much more expensive as far as materials go. A Tusq saddle will usually run $12 to $18, and a Tusq nut will usually cost $12 to $20. That means depending on which nut and saddle you need, it could end up costing you almost $40 to do your whole guitar. If you're comparing that to bone, especially if you're cutting your own blanks, the cost for Tusq could end up being more than 15 times higher than bone in material costs alone. One of the most confusing parts about installing a Tusq saddle is choosing the right one. With almost 30 different options on their website, this can be a daunting task, especially with fretboards of different radiuses. That was one of the biggest comments I got on my last video was, which one do I get? For most of the saddles on their website, the radius isn't even listed, except in a few specific cases that they have a specific radius like a 10-inch or a 16-inch. I actually reached out to Graphtech to ask about this, and they replied that on an acoustic guitar, including this information created more confusion than clarity, and that a standard saddle will work with most applications. Go figure. Just make sure to measure your old saddle and order one that's a little wider and a little longer and a little taller than the one you're replacing, I guess. Unless you have a specifically flat or specifically round radius. Look, since it's already shaped, it should install about as quickly as a plastic saddle. Just dial in the thickness if necessary, like I've already shown, and then dial in the overall length, like I've already shown. In my case, I found the Tusq saddle to be a little too thick, which I was able to dial in quickly, and it had an almost perfect length. That was great. Once that's done, and it fits in the saddle slot perfectly, then you're ready to dial in the string height. So now we're at the same spot on all three saddle types. And the process is the same for all three materials. So let's talk about how to dial in the saddle height. About time, right? I should mention that this step is usually fine-tuned while dialing in the action during the final step of the guitar. And we're going to talk more about that step in the third video of the series. However, in all likelihood, these saddles are going to be too high, and boy were they ever. So look, we're going to need to adjust them. In this case, I installed a set of cheap strings since they were going to need to go on and come off several times. And I checked the string height at the 12th fret. I determined where the string height was at and how far down it would need to come on the bass and the treble side of the saddle. Then I loosened the strings and removed the saddles, making sure to mark which side of the saddles faced the fretboard so I wouldn't lose track. Now listen, I mentioned this in my Taylor neck shim video. I'll put a link in the card if you want to watch that. But the way that the math works out, whatever work you do on the saddle has half as much effect on the action at the 12th fret. If you lower the action on the saddle by 2 millimeters, then your action at the 12th fret will be lowered by 1 millimeter. Look, this concept can be tricky to understand, so I worked up this elaborate demonstration using this project ukulele that my mother got me. Check this out. I didn't even think this would work, but it turned out to be an amazing demonstration. On this ukulele kit, I have a preposterously high action due to this ridiculous excuse for a saddle piece that I have jammed in there. I only have one string strung up because this is a demonstration, but the concept is the same. And what is a ukulele but a tiny guitar anyway? When you measure the action, you usually measure from the top of the frets at the 12th fret to the bottom of the strings. In this example, you can see that the action where the 12th fret would be is an astonishing 32 millimeters. For the sake of round numbers here, I decided that I wanted to lower the action by 20 millimeters. Because the nut functions as a fulcrum that the strings pivot on, this means that in order to lower the action by 20 millimeters, we need to remove twice that amount from the saddle. In this case, 40 millimeters. You can see here that I used calipers to measure 40 millimeters and marked it on the saddle piece and then sawed that off. Here's the evidence. I removed 40 millimeters from the saddle, and you can see that measured with the calipers. After that's done, I restring and remeasure. Now the action is 12 millimeters. It was 32 millimeters. We removed 40 millimeters. That means the action was lowered by 20 millimeters, which is exactly what I was trying to do. Obviously, this example uses preposterously exaggerated measurements to prove the point. And once done, we're still left with action that's too high. I just wanted to show you how to understand what's going on under the saddle, so to speak. This shows the principle of what happens when you remove material from the bottom of the saddle. So when I'm lowering the saddle, I often need to remove different amounts from each end of the saddle. For example, on each of the 3 saddles that I processed for this project, I needed to remove much different amounts from the treble and the base sides of the saddle. For each saddle, my target action was 2.5 millimeters on the base side and 1.5 millimeters on the treble side. And I feel like that's a good all-around middle ground for an acoustic guitar. I sawed each saddle, measured the string height, used this number to determine how much to remove from the bottom of each saddle. Removing material precisely from the bottom of the saddle is a delicate task, and the way that I do this is with a specialty tool called the nut and saddle sander. Look, these tools are pretty expensive, especially if you buy them from StewMac. I think theirs are like $200 or something like that. Look, I bought a knockoff version from Amazon a few years ago for like $55. It's fine. Philadelphia Luthier also sells something like this. This tool makes removing precise amounts from the bottom of nuts or saddles pretty easy. In each case, I take special note of which side of the saddle is the front, because then you flip it over and install it in the clamp. And once you do that, it's easy to lose track. I use this really cool tool to set the nut in the jig, but you can easily use calipers or even a setup card to set how much of the saddle sticks up. This step is a little finicky here, as there's a lot of back and forth until you get it just right. But once you do, clamp tightly on the screws and run it across some sandpaper that has been secured to a flat surface until all 4 bearing wheels are able to touch the flat surface at the same time. If the saddle has a lot of material that needs to be removed, I like to save some time by throwing the whole thing in the clamp and filing away a bunch of the material with a file until I'm starting to get close to the end and then finish on the paper. This is where the huge difference between bone and other materials became evident, because I filed on the bone saddle for ages before I got it low enough to transition to the sanding board. Jeez. Once all 4 bearing wheels are on the surface, that means you've taken your saddle down as low as you can. Pop it out of the jig, install it on your guitar, and string up to check how this change affected your action. You may find out that your adjustments worked out perfectly. You may discover that your saddle requires more adjustments still. In one case of the 3, I realized that I did one of my calculations wrong and didn't remove enough material from the treble side of the bone saddle. Look, I make mistakes too, guys. I'm gonna have to go back and fix that, but you know what? I'm gonna do it during the setup phase. Whatever your measurement or adjustment to the saddle is, you want the bottom of the saddle to be nice and flat and perfectly squared to the side. Of course, you don't need a fancy nut and saddle sander to do this job. You could definitely do this job by hand. I like to use the tool because it's ease of setup and the precision and repeatability. However, you can easily mark your measurements with a mechanical pencil or X-Acto knife and carry them across with a straight edge and then work to the line by hand. You know, a lot of people do it that way. Once your string height is dialed in and your saddle is finally done, you're well on your way to being able to being your own guitar tech. Learning the correct way to replace the saddle on your acoustic guitar, it's a great skill to learn. Additionally, understanding the differences in cost and labor requirements between the different materials are critical in helping you to make the right decisions in materials for either you or your customer. Servicing your own instrument, it's really rewarding. I know it is for me, and it'll help you to understand your instruments on a deeper and more fundamental level. And even making this video, I know that I learned more myself. However, as we all know, labor and material costs are only part of the equation. The biggest factor is the sound. And how do they sound? Well, you're gonna have to tune back in. In the next video, I'm gonna talk at length about how to properly install the nut. And in the final video, we're gonna finalize the setup and go head to head with all three materials to finally hear what the differences are. Look, I'm really eager to hear for myself the tonal differences of each material and see which one I like the best, since honestly, I don't know which I'll prefer. I haven't finished yet. If you're as interested as I am, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you can be notified when those videos come out. And until next time, guys, don't be a jerk.